In the deep forest where sunlight filtered through endless layers of leaves, there existed a vast kingdom of birds. No single ruler governed them. No law unified them. Only instinct, fear, and survival guided their lives. Every morning, when the sky turned pale gold, the birds would scatter across branches and rivers to search for food. And every evening, when shadows swallowed the forest floor, they returned quietly to their nests, wings tired, hearts unsettled. For a long time, this fragile balance had survived. But not in peace. Because above them, the sky was not empty. It belonged to the hunters. Eagles circled like silent storms. Falcons cut through the air like sharpened thoughts. Every descent from the sky carried uncertainty: who would be chosen today, who would disappear before sunset. The birds lived between two moments, the moment of flight, and the moment of fear. And slowly, fear began to gather weight. It was not loud at first. It came as hesitation before flight. As silence in the trees. As sudden stops in mid-song. Until one morning, a small sparrow finally spoke what everyone had been avoiding. "We cannot continue like this." The forest did not respond. Only the wind moved through the branches, as if listening. The sparrow continued, voice trembling but steady. "Every day we scatter without protection. Every day we lose someone. We do not even know who we are anymore, only that we are waiting to be taken." A long silence followed. Then, from different corners of the forest, other birds began to gather. One by one. Not because they were summoned, but because they were tired. A white swan glided down first, its presence calm but distant. Then came pigeons, doves, geese, each carrying stories they did not speak aloud. Soon, the branches filled with wings, until the forest itself felt like it was holding its breath. At the center of the gathering, a decision slowly formed. Not spoken at first. Only felt. A kingdom without a king cannot defend itself. So they would choose one. A protector. A voice. A ruler of the sky. And in that moment, the forest, once divided by instinct, became united by a single idea: order must be created, or destruction will continue. But none of them yet understood what kind of order they were about to invite into their world. As the forest filled with birds, the silence slowly transformed into discussion. Not chaos, but something heavier. A shared urgency that pressed on every wing. The question had already been born, even before it was spoken: who will protect us? At first, suggestions came gently, like hesitant ripples on water. A swan stepped forward. Its voice was calm, almost distant. "I can guide with grace," it said. "I can keep peace among us." Some birds nodded. Swan had always been admired for its elegance, its ability to remain composed even when danger passed nearby. But then a sparrow spoke quietly from the edge. "Grace does not stop an eagle." The words fell into the gathering like a small stone into still water. No one answered immediately. Then came the peacock. It unfolded its feathers slowly, like a living painting catching unseen light. "I can inspire unity," it said proudly. "When others see beauty, they forget fear." For a moment, the birds were mesmerized. But somewhere in the back, a dove whispered, "Beauty does not defend nests." The peacock turned away, slightly offended, and the spell of admiration broke. One by one, more names were spoken. The goose, strong in formation flight, but easily confused under pressure. The pigeon, peaceful, but too gentle to resist violence. Even the heron, patient, observant, but too slow when danger strikes suddenly. Each suggestion rose, and each was quietly dismantled. Not with anger, but with fear disguised as logic. Because deep down, every bird was no longer asking, "Who is the best?" They were asking something far more desperate: "Who will never fail us?" And that question has no honest answer. As the sun climbed higher, the gathering grew restless. Shadows shortened. Heat pressed into the branches. Somewhere far above, an eagle circled once, then disappeared again into the brightness. A reminder. The sky was never empty. Then, slowly, a new presence entered the conversation. It did not announce itself. It did not ask for attention. It simply watched. From the hollow of an old tree, two glowing eyes opened. Amber. Still. Unblinking. The owl had been there all along. And somehow, no one had truly noticed until now. A murmur spread through the branches. Not excitement. Recognition. He sees at night. He does not fear darkness. He watches when we sleep. The idea began to form not as speech, but as relief. A creature that does not sleep like us could watch while we sleep. A guardian for the unseen hours. And slowly, relief turned into certainty. Certainty turned into agreement. And agreement began to feel like safety. The owl did not speak much. It only tilted its head slightly, as if listening to a future already decided. But in the forest of frightened hearts, silence often sounds like wisdom. And wisdom, when misunderstood, becomes authority. By the time the sun reached its highest point, the decision had already begun to solidify. A coronation was forming, not through truth, but through exhaustion. And somewhere in the distance, unnoticed by most, a black shadow shifted quietly among the branches. A crow was watching. Not approving. Not celebrating. Just watching. As if remembering something everyone else had chosen to forget. The forest had begun to shift. What was once a discussion slowly hardened into a direction. And direction, once formed, has a dangerous property: it begins to feel like truth. By the time the sun leaned toward the west, the decision no longer felt like a choice. It felt like something already concluded. Branches that had once carried debate now carried expectation. And expectation, in collective minds, becomes pressure. In the center of this growing certainty stood the owl. Still silent. Still observing. Its amber eyes reflected every bird, yet revealed nothing of its own intention. To many, this silence was wisdom. To a few, it was unreadable. But to none did it feel unsafe. Because fear had already found a shape that felt controllable. Then came movement from the edge of the gathering. A shadow cut across the lower branches. Black feathers. Sharp eyes. A presence that did not blend into comfort. The crow had arrived. It did not rush. It did not announce. It simply landed where it could be seen. And waited. For a moment, no one spoke. Not because they did not see it, but because they did not want to. Finally, the crow spoke. Its voice was not loud, but it carried the kind of clarity that does not need volume. You are choosing based on fear, not understanding. A few birds shifted uneasily. The peacock turned its head away. The swan lowered its gaze. The owl remained still. The crow continued. You are choosing what looks safe in the dark, without asking what happens in the light. Silence tightened. Not peaceful silence, but resistant silence. The kind that forms when truth enters a space that has already chosen its answer. The crow flapped its wings once, lightly, as if releasing something heavy. You admire its night vision, it said, glancing toward the owl. But you forget, we live in the day. A ripple moved through the birds. Some frowned. Some looked away. A few exchanged uncertain glances. Then the crow spoke the words that changed the temperature of the air. It cannot protect what it cannot see. A pause. Long enough for meaning to settle. Then another sentence, quieter, but sharper. And it does not know how to lead what it does not understand. For the first time, the owl moved. A very small movement. a tilt of the head. But in that motion, something in the forest shifted, not physically, but psychologically. The birds felt it. Not aggression. Not denial. But something colder. Evaluation. The owl was no longer just an option. It was being questioned. And that is when discomfort entered the gathering. Because once a decision begins to be examined, it can no longer remain effortless. A goose stepped forward hesitantly. But, who else sees in the dark? A pigeon added softly, we have suffered enough. We just need protection. The crow looked at them. Not harshly. But steadily. You are not choosing protection, it said. You are choosing certainty. That sentence landed differently. Some birds did not understand it. Others understood it too well. Certainty feels like safety when fear is loud enough. The owl remained silent throughout. But its eyes narrowed slightly. Not in anger. In recognition. The crow finally stepped back. Not defeated. Not victorious. Just aware that what it had said would not be heard by those who needed it most. From a distant branch, it settled again into shadow. Watching. Waiting. As the forest slowly returned to its momentum. Because decisions, once emotionally convenient, are difficult to reverse. And the idea of a king had already begun to feel like relief. Even if it was not yet wisdom. By now, the forest had reached a strange equilibrium. Not peace. Not clarity. But something far more fragile, agreement born from exhaustion. The idea of the owl as king was no longer a proposal. It was becoming a direction no one wanted to interrupt. Because interrupting certainty requires energy. And fear had already consumed most of it. The crow remained on a distant branch. Still watching. Still present. But increasingly alone in what it could see. Below, preparations for coronation had already begun. Soft moss was gathered to form a seat. Golden leaves were arranged like ceremonial light. Flowers were placed carefully, as if beauty could stabilize reality. Even water, clear, cold, reflective, was brought in small bowls for ritual cleansing. Everything looked sacred. Everything looked right. And that was precisely the danger. Because when appearance becomes harmony, questioning begins to feel like disruption. The owl sat slightly apart from the center. It did not interfere. It did not refuse. It simply accepted the attention being placed upon it, like something inevitable. Its amber eyes reflected the gathering, but those eyes revealed nothing warm, nothing reassuring. Only observation. Deep, silent, detached. And in that silence, birds began to project meaning. Calm, control, protection. Words that did not come from the owl, but from the fear inside the birds themselves. The crow noticed this. It shifted slightly on its branch, then spoke again. Not to convince, but to interrupt the drift. You are building a crown, it said, but you are not building understanding. A few heads turned. Not many. The pull of ceremony was already too strong. The crow continued. You are decorating uncertainty with ritual, so it feels like safety. The peacock bristled slightly. The swan looked away again. The goose muttered softly, at least this feels organized. That sentence said more than it intended. Because organization often replaces understanding when understanding is too uncomfortable. The crow did not argue further. Instead, it changed tone. Quieter. Heavier. If you choose it, the crow said, do not be surprised when it behaves like what it is, not what you imagined. That sentence lingered longer than the others. But instead of stopping the ceremony, it accelerated it. Because warning, when too late, often becomes fuel for urgency. And urgency feels like confirmation. The owl finally stood. Slowly. Deliberately. Its movement was not dramatic. But it changed the atmosphere instantly. All eyes turned toward it. Even the crow paused. For a brief moment, something ancient seemed to pass through the forest. Not sound. Not wind. But expectation becoming form. The owl opened its wings slightly. Not in display, but in acceptance. And that was enough. The birds interpreted it as readiness, as destiny, as confirmation. The crow closed its eyes for a brief moment. Not in surrender, but in recognition of a pattern it had seen before. When fear chooses a protector, it stops asking whether protection understands fear itself. Then it looked away. Because there are moments when witnessing no longer changes outcomes. Only memory. Below, the coronation continued to form itself. And the forest, relieved to have finally decided, did not notice what it had quietly given up, the right to question the thing it was about to depend on. The ceremony began not with a declaration, but with inevitability. No one said, "Start." It simply began. As if the forest itself had agreed in silence. The owl stepped forward into the center. Slow. Measured. Unopposed. The branches above were heavy with watching eyes, yet the air felt strangely light, like something important had already been decided, and all that remained was performance. Golden leaves shimmered under filtered sunlight. The moss seat waited. The birds formed a wide circle, careful not to disturb the symmetry of the moment. Symmetry always makes uncertainty feel smaller. A pigeon carried the first offering, clear water in a carved leaf bowl. A dove followed with seeds. A swan placed a strand of white feather, symbolic of peace. Each gesture was gentle. Each gesture was final. And finality, when wrapped in ritual, feels like relief. The owl lowered its head slightly. Not in submission. Not in gratitude. But in acknowledgement. As if it understood the role before it was fully given. The crow watched from afar. Still. Unmoving. Its presence felt like a question the forest refused to read. At the center, an elder heron began the invocation. Its voice was slow, ceremonial. "We gather not in fear," it said, "but in need." A pause. A shift in air. Then it continued. "We gather not to lose freedom, but to preserve life." The words were carefully chosen. Softened. Polished. Because truth, when too sharp, is often rejected before it is understood. The owl opened its wings wider now. Not dramatically. But enough for shadow and light to rearrange themselves around it. For a brief moment, it looked larger than it was. Or perhaps the forest made it so. Projection is a powerful form of enlargement. The elder heron approached. Slowly. It placed a simple mark of recognition upon the owl's brow, made of crushed golden pollen. No crown. No medal. Only symbolism. But symbolism, when believed, becomes structure. A murmur passed through the birds. Not celebration. Not joy. But something quieter, relief. The ceremony had succeeded. The uncertainty had a face. The fear had a boundary. The unknown had been assigned responsibility. And in that assignment, the forest exhaled. Deeply. Collectively. Dangerously. The owl remained silent. But now its silence was no longer just observation. It was authority, and authority, once granted, begins to reshape perception backward, changing how everything before it is remembered. The sparrow that once spoke was now seen as an early supporter. The crow that warned was now seen as unnecessarily resistant. Truth itself began to reorganize around the outcome. And that is the most subtle transformation of all. From a distant branch, the crow finally spoke again. But this time, no one turned. Not because they did not hear, but because they no longer needed to. You have not chosen protection, it said softly. You have chosen relief. No response, only the continuation of ceremony. The owl turned slightly toward the forest. Its amber eyes now reflected not individuals, but a collective expectation. And expectation, once reflected back, becomes responsibility. Or burden, depending on who holds it. The coronation ended without ending. Because such moments do not conclude. They settle. Like dust. Like belief. Like consequences not yet visible. The forest, now unified under a single silent center, did not notice the smallest shift beginning beneath the surface. When responsibility is given without understanding, it does not disappear, it waits. And somewhere in the deeper branches, the crow closed its eyes again. Not in defeat, but in the quiet knowledge that some warnings are not meant to prevent events, only to survive them. Night arrived without announcement. It simply replaced the day, as it always had. But this time, the forest felt different. Not because anything visible had changed, but because something invisible now had a name. The owl remained at the center of the forest's perception, even though its body had moved to a higher branch above the gathering ground. From there, it could see everything. Or at least, that was what the birds believed. Below, the forest settled into its familiar rhythm. Wings folded. Nests closed. Breath slowed. But sleep did not arrive equally for all. Because the idea of protection, once installed, does not remove fear. It reorganizes it. Some birds slept more peacefully than before. The illusion of guardianship softened their vigilance. Others slept lightly, disturbed by small sounds they had previously ignored. And a few did not sleep at all. Among them was the crow. Perched far from the ceremonial center, it remained awake, not from fear, but from observation. The owl, now designated as king, did not move much. It watched. Always watched, but its watching was divided now between two worlds, the visible forest of branches, and the invisible forest of shadows beneath them. Night creatures stirred. Rustling leaves. distant wing beats. The forest was never truly silent. But now silence was expected of it. And expectation creates pressure even in darkness. A faint movement occurred near the lower canopy. A small rustle. Then another. A sudden flicker of motion. A sparrow startled awake. It chirped once, sharp, instinctive. The sound broke the delicate illusion of calm. Immediately, the owl turned its head. Slow. Precise. Its amber eyes cut through the darkness. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a shift. Not visible at first, but felt. The owl launched downward. Silently. Almost without transition between thought and motion. The forest barely had time to register it. A shadow intersected another shadow. A brief struggle. A snap of air. Then stillness again. Too quick to interpret. Too sudden to question. When the owl returned to its branch, something small was held in its beak. Not clearly visible. But understood. A message had been delivered. Not spoken. Demonstrated. A few birds stirred in their sleep. Some felt reassured. Others felt something they could not name. Not safety. Not fear. But redefinition. The crow observed everything. It did not react. Because reaction implies surprise. And nothing here was surprising anymore. Only unfolding. Slowly. Inevitable in shape. The owl settled again. Its presence now extended further into the forest than its body. Because authority does not travel physically. It spreads through interpretation. And interpretation spreads faster than movement. By midnight, the forest had already begun to adjust. Rustles became smaller. Sounds became restrained. Even fear learned to behave. And yet, somewhere deep in the branches, a thought began to form among those still awake. If protection must be demonstrated, what happens when there is always something to demonstrate it against? The crow closed its eyes briefly. Not in peace, but in recognition. The first night of a king is never about protection. It is about definition. And definitions, once accepted, begin to demand continuation. Days do not announce their turning points. They simply continue. until something within them begins to feel different. By the second night, the forest had already adapted. Not fully. Not consciously. But in the quiet way living systems adjust to pressure they cannot remove. Movements became smaller. Flights became more calculated. Calls became shorter. Even hesitation began to disappear, not because fear was gone, but because fear had found structure. The owl remained consistent. Unchanging. Predictable in presence, but not in emotion. It did not speak. It did not explain. It only acted when silence was interrupted. And that was enough for interpretation to grow. Because in uncertain systems, action without explanation becomes mythology. And mythology grows faster than truth. A pigeon that flew too low at dusk did not return. No one saw what happened clearly. But many saw what they believed happened. And belief spreads faster than sight. The next morning, the forest was quieter than before. Not peaceful. But careful. Careful is what fear becomes when it learns discipline. The crow watched this transformation from above. It did not intervene, because it understood something the forest was only beginning to experience. Once fear becomes structured, it stops feeling like fear. It becomes behavior. The owl, meanwhile, showed no change. It did not celebrate. It did not escalate. It simply remained positioned between stillness and interruption. And in that positioning, it became a reference point. Not a ruler in the traditional sense, but a measurement. And everything measured begins to adjust itself. Birds no longer asked, "Is it safe?" They began asking, "Is it acceptable to move?" That subtle shift changed everything. Safety is absolute. Acceptability is relational. One depends on reality. The other depends on perception. And perception can be shaped. At midday, a small flock gathered near the lower branches. There was tension, but no conversation. Only hesitation passing between eyes. One bird finally attempted to break formation. A simple movement. A flight across a short gap between trees. Ordinary. Routine. But it triggered silence. Not immediately. But internally. A collective pause. As if the forest itself was waiting for permission. Then the owl appeared. No sound. No warning. Just presence in motion. The flock froze. Nothing visible happened afterward. No struggle. No chaos. Only absence where motion had been. And absence, when witnessed without explanation, becomes instruction. After that moment, no bird repeated the attempt. Not because they were told not to, but because the cost of uncertainty had increased without announcement. The crow closed its eyes again that evening. It was no longer watching events. It was watching pattern formation. And patterns, once stable, do not require enforcement. They enforce themselves. Far below, the owl remained on its branch, still, contained. But now the forest no longer saw stillness. It saw consequence waiting in stillness. And that is how fear changes shape. Not by increasing, but by organizing itself into the structure of daily life. Silence, once established as order, does not remain passive. It begins to demand participation. By the third cycle of night and day, the forest had entered a new rhythm. Not imposed, but absorbed. Birds no longer moved freely across space. They moved within invisible boundaries. Not drawn on the ground, but drawn in expectation. A branch once safe became uncertain if crossed too often. A clearing once neutral became watched if entered without hesitation. Nothing had been formally declared. And yet everything had changed. The owl did not expand its presence. It did not need to, because influence no longer required movement. It required memory. And memory was now doing the work. The crow observed this with a stillness that was not calm. It was precision. A kind of clarity that comes when emotion is no longer useful for interpretation. From its branch, it noticed something subtle. No new fear had been added. Instead, old fear had become continuous, unbroken, self-sustaining. A system that no longer required events to trigger it. Only possibility. A sparrow dropped a seed accidentally near a lower branch. It did not return immediately to retrieve it, not because of danger, but because of hesitation. That hesitation lasted longer than the act itself. And in that gap, the forest changed again. Nothing happened. And yet something was learned. The owl, as always, responded only when movement crossed invisible thresholds. A rustle too close to a restricted zone. A flight too low near silent air. Each intervention was brief. Minimal. Almost mechanical. But in repetition, minimal becomes doctrine. The birds began to adapt not to punishment, but to anticipation of punishment. And anticipation is more powerful than experience, because experience ends. Anticipation continues. At dusk, a small argument broke out between two birds over nesting space. Ordinary conflict. No danger involved. But both stopped midway. Not because resolution was reached, but because escalation felt possible. And possibility had become heavier than reality. They separated without agreement, without resolution, only withdrawal. The crow closed its eyes briefly, not in rest, but in recognition of a system reaching maturity, because this was the final stage of structured fear, when conflict no longer needs resolution, because avoidance has already resolved everything. That night, the forest was quieter than before. But it was not peaceful. It was managed. And management is what fear becomes when it has learned to regulate itself. The owl remained unchanged. But now its stillness was no longer interpreted as presence. It was interpreted as condition. A constant background rule. Like gravity. Not noticed, but always accounted for. Somewhere deep in the canopy, a young bird attempted to sing. The sound was soft, uncertain. It lasted only a few notes before stopping. Not interrupted. Not punished. Just self-corrected. And that, the crow realized, was the most profound transformation yet. When silence no longer needs enforcement. Because it has been internalized. And internalized silence is no longer fear of authority. It is the reproduction of authority within the self. The crow finally shifted its weight on the branch. It did not leave. It did not intervene. Because at this stage, intervention no longer changes direction. Only observation remains as testimony. Below, the forest continued its careful existence. Not broken. Not healed. But stabilized into a shape that no longer required agreement. Only compliance with what had already been learned. There comes a stage in every system where power stops being noticed as power. It becomes environment. By the fourth cycle, the owl was no longer discussed. Not because it was forgotten, but because it had become unnecessary to mention. Like wind. Like temperature. Like the sky itself. It was simply there. Always present in implication, even when absent in sight. Birds no longer said, "The owl will see." They said, "It will be seen." And this reversal mattered more than language, because it removed the subject. And when the subject disappears, accountability becomes atmosphere. The forest had entered that condition. Movement had not stopped, but it had become filtered through invisible calculation. A bird deciding to fly did not ask, "Is it safe?" It asked something subtler, "Will this be interpreted?" Interpretation had replaced danger. And interpretation is far less predictable. The crow noticed this shift not as surprise, but as completion of a curve it had been watching since the beginning. Fear, once structured, does not stay static. It evolves into regulation. And regulation eventually dissolves into assumption. The owl did not appear more often. It did not need to. Because presence was no longer physical. It was distributed. In pauses. In hesitation. In altered timing between actions. Even in the way birds looked at empty branches before deciding to land. At midday, a group of birds gathered near a river. They did not speak about the owl directly. They no longer needed to. Instead, they discussed safe routes, acceptable distances, reasonable timing. Language had shifted. Not by force, but by adaptation. One bird suggested crossing the river at a narrower point. Another hesitated. Not because of water, but because of visibility. Too open, it said. No further explanation was needed. Everyone understood. Openness had become risk. Not because of attack, but because of observation. Meanwhile, above them, the owl remained unseen. But its influence was present in every adjustment. The crow watched from a higher branch, noting something deeper now. The forest was no longer reacting to a ruler. It was reacting to a model. And models are more powerful than rulers. Because rulers can be removed. Models persist. That evening, a sudden gust of wind moved through the canopy. Branches swayed. Leaves shifted unpredictably. For a brief moment, the system loosened. And in that looseness, something almost happened. A flock nearly flew without checking. But mid-motion, hesitation returned. Not externally triggered. Internally generated. The flock corrected itself before any intervention occurred. And that correction required no king. Only internalized expectation. The crow closed its eyes. Not in resignation, but in confirmation of the final transformation, when fear no longer needs to act, because it has already taught others how to act instead. Night fell again, and the forest, now fully adapted, no longer lived under a king. It lived under a pattern. And patterns do not sleep. They only continue. In time, even the idea of a king becomes unnecessary to remember. Not because it disappears, but because it is fully absorbed. The forest no longer spoke of the owl as ruler, guardian, or authority. Those words had slowly faded, like prints washed away by rain that never fully stops. What remained was simpler and more irreversible. A way of living. The owl still existed. It still watched. It still acted when thresholds were crossed. But by now, the forest no longer perceived those moments as events. They were conditions of reality itself. Like gravity pulling downward without announcement. Like night arriving without permission. The crow remained on its branch. Older now in presence, though time had not visibly changed it. It had witnessed the full transformation, from fear to structure, from structure to behavior, from behavior to assumption, and finally, from assumption to identity. The forest no longer needed enforcement, because enforcement had migrated inward. No voice needed to command silence anymore. Silence had learned to reproduce itself. At dawn, the first light entered the canopy. Soft. Indifferent. Unaware of the systems it illuminated, a young bird prepared to sing. It hesitated. Not because it remembered punishment, but because it remembered patterns. The hesitation lasted a moment longer than instinct. Then the song was not sung. Not forbidden. Not stopped. Just absent. And in that absence, the crow understood something final. The most complete authority is the one that no longer needs to act. Because everything has already adjusted. The owl, now distant in perception, remained part of the forest the way weather remains part of landscape. Not questioned. Not evaluated. Simply accounted for. A presence without dialogue. A structure without explanation. A certainty that no longer needed justification. Far above, the crow finally spoke, not to the forest, but to the air itself. You did not choose a king, it said softly. You learned one. No response came. There never would be. Because systems that reach this depth of adaptation no longer reply. They only continue. The wind moved through the branches. Leaves turned slightly. The forest breathed as one body again. Not united by agreement, but by conditioning. And in that quiet continuity, the story did not end. It stabilized, like all things that are no longer questioned. Like all things that have become normal. Like fear that has learned to call itself order. And somewhere beyond thought, beyond language, beyond warning, the crow remained awake a little longer, bearing witness to a truth that no longer needed to be spoken. What begins as protection does not end as protection. It ends as structure. And structure does not end. It only remains, ***.